Recording in progress.
Remember me, when the sun comes up in the morning sky. There I will be, soaring with the eagle so high, feeling free. Remember me, down the road, hand in hand, you and me. Hey-oh, hey-oh, hey-oh. Hello, hey. Hey, we are waiting, oh, hey, oh, hey. Hey, we are waiting, oh, hey, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey. Hey, we are waiting, oh, hey, oh, hey. Hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh. Remember me, when the sun comes up in the morning sky. There I will be, soaring with the eagle so high, feeling free. Remember me, down the road, hand in hand, you and me. Hey-oh, hey-oh, hey-oh. Hey-oh, hey. Hey, we are waiting, oh, hey-oh, hey. Hey, we are waiting, oh, hey-oh, hey. Hey-oh, hey. Hey, we are waiting, oh, hey-oh, hey. Hey-oh, hey-oh, hey-oh. Remember me, when the sun comes up in the morning sky. There I will be, soaring with the eagle so high, feeling free. Remember me, down the road, hand in hand, you and me. Hey-oh, hey-oh, hey-oh. Hey-oh, hey. Remember me, when the sun comes up in the morning sky. There I will be, soaring with the eagle so high, feeling free. Remember me, down the road, hand in hand, you and me. Hey-oh, hey-oh, hey-oh.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Jennifer Pirtle. I use she, her pronouns. I'm enrolled in the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians, and I'm excited to welcome everyone to PCC's 5th annual event honoring missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives. A little bit more about myself is that I'm a full-time mom and community auntie. a student here at PCC, but soon to be transferring to PSU in the fall. I wear plenty of hats in the community, as most of us do. In this setting, I am the Native Nations Coordinator at PCC. I also work as a community health worker with the Native Wellness Institute, as well as with the youth at NARA Youth Residential. So this event is many offered throughout the week. So to see our full list of events, please visit our website here at pcc.edu/MMIW. Art for today's event was created by Steph Littlebird, artist, curator, writer, and registered member of Oregon's Grand Ronde Confederated Tribes. And the poster was created by PCC student advocate Mary Slulis. If you are joining us on Zoom, please click the closed captioning button to turn on the live captioning. Captioning will show up automatically on the Facebook and YouTube streams. Thank you to PCC's Disability Services for funding CART, transcription, and American Sign Language interpretation today. Thank you to Elizabeth Archer, who's providing today's live captioning, and to Dana Redfield and Melissa Harris, who are providing ASL interpretation. Thank you everyone who has supported this event over the years, including our PCC Native American Studies faculty, colleagues, and all of the race, Indigenous nations, and gender studies faculty. There are also a lot of people who helped spread the word about this event or supported in other ways. So we thank all of you for your help. I would also like to thank and name the planning committee that put so much time and effort into making this event happen. Monica from PCC Multicultural Centers, Renee, Jess, Alicia, and Kira from PCC's Women Resource Centers, and Delinda from PCC's Student Life and Leadership, and me from Native Nations. A little bit about Native Nations is club is that we support intertribal Native American and Alaskan Native students attending PCC, as well as all students wanting to attend with culturally responsible workshops, academic tutoring, community resource connections, as well as bridging the community to create learning experiences around NAA and history and culture. To create culturally aware education discussions, create community among Native American and Alaskan Natives and other Indigenous groups, and of course, foster environment stewardship and Indigenous identities. We have club meetings weekly, every Tuesday at 1 p.m. via Zoom. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at jenniferpurtle@pcc.edu. Thank you. Thank you to all the departments that have supported this event financially. This includes PCC Disability Services, Student Life and Leadership, Multicultural Centers, and Women's Resource Centers. Today we are talking about some really challenging issues, and as any other times, it may get heavy. So we do want to remind yourself to take care of yourself, drink plenty of water, take a break, you know, mute and go outside, get a breath of air, whatever that takes, you know, and if there's any way that we can help, please feel free to reach out. So I'd like to introduce today's speakers. First is Dr. Luhui Whitebear. She was enrolled member of the band of the Chumash Nation with Quastec and Kuchimi ancestry. She is an associate of the Kakuis Manu Inahas on campus. They are a multicultural and queer two-spirit Indigenous community organizer, educator, and relative. Rachel teaches at Portland State University in the Indigenous Nations Studies Department. They are also the Associate Director of Equity and Racial Justice Education at the Oregon Food Bank. Next is Renea Perry. Renea is an enrolled member of the Tlingit Haida Nation. Her family is also Inupiat and Northern European. She is an instructor at PCC, where she taught the region's only community college class on Alaskan Natives. Renea works as an Indigenous health equity consultant, and she's also the coordinator for today's event. Renea is going to be moderating our panel today. Renea, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Jennifer, for getting us started today. I just wanted to welcome everybody. We have about 200 attendees today registered for this event, and we're grateful to have you join us. Most of our registrants and attendees are students for whom we've prepared wellness gift bags and a grocery gift card. Just a reminder, today's event is being recorded. All attendees will have access to the recording, which will be stored on PCC's Multicultural Center YouTube channel. The link to that will be emailed out after the event. A note about the chat, please put any questions you have in the chat. The panelists won't be watching the chat, but staff will get your questions to us. Welcome, Luhui and Rachel. So glad to have you with us. Just to get us started, as you introduce yourselves, can you share what excites you about this work? Luhui, would you like to start? Thank you.
Rachel was going to start.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rachel. Sorry. No, you go. No, you go. I appreciate you all. I hope that wherever you are, wherever you're coming from, you're having a good day. Just that this day is good. My name is Rachel Black Elk Malakota Malambi. I'm very thankful to be in this space. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns. I am very thankful to be a guest on the homelands of other tribal nations and indigenous peoples. So I'm just uplifting some names of the Kalapuya peoples whose homelands I got to build kinship with over my lifetime. And I'm really thankful to do this work because it reminds me of what it means to love. And so as we begin to talk about hard things or scary things or things that may bring up memories in our minds or our bodies, I'm very much grounded and I'm very much thankful for the love that exists and the love that protects my mind and my body and my spirit. And it's really beautiful to find examples of this. And so I just will start off that way and I'll pass it over to Luhui and say, Wopela, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Haku, everyone. Again, my name is Luhui Whitebear. I use she, her pronouns. Member of the coastal band of the Chumash Nation with Cochimi and Waztec ancestry. And I'm really happy to be here. I spent my entire life between my homelands, coastal Chumash homelands in California, as well as my stepdad's homelands over in the Siletz area and on Kalapuya lands for my entire life in those areas. And I'm really thankful to be a guest on their lands to continue to work and live at OSU as well. I'm an assistant professor for the School of Language, Culture, and Society. We're in the process of building our Indigenous Studies program here, and that's part of what I get to help with. And I'm also the center director of the Kagaweeks Manaina House, which serves Indigenous students from the Americas and Pacific Islands. So it's kind of a blended position. And what excites me about this work, besides being in community with other amazing people, is just, I don't know if I would say excite, I would say like it fuels me and it motivates me to do this kind of work. I'm going to share a poem with you that kind of talks about my why, and it's called Walking with Them. Disclaimer that this may bring up some feels for people. Walking down the road in East Lansing, snow crunching beneath my feet, listening to the night sounds, laughter in the distance, alert, aware of the cold. How many sisters have walked alone? That crunching sound beneath their feet, that distance laughter coming closer with each step. The coldness crawls into your clothes, cold, alone with each step. I read a story of a woman found in a ditch earlier that day. Not here, but it could have been. Have you seen the report of murdered and missing Indigenous women in urban areas? This just isn't a res problem, just an Indian problem. It's just a problem. That woman was found in a ditch not far from a town. Her name added to that ever-growing list of lost sisters. Her name not added to any statistics. Too far away from the borders of jurisdictional tracking. Another Indigenous sister discarded, tossed aside, like something to dispose of. The snow crunches beneath my feet. Each breath, each step a gift. I've read that report and many others. The article said she died of exposure, left alone out there. But no one really ever knows exactly what happens. Have you seen the prosecution rates? She is one of how many sisters until it ends. The bite of the cold tells me of the pain she felt. The crunch of the snow makes the same sound no matter where it lands. I keep walking. Step after step, I search for that story. Indigenous woman found in ditch. Article after article floods my screen, in ditches, in garbage cans, in rivers, in basements, on bedroom floors, discarded, left alone. The snow crunches beneath my feet, and those are only the ones they found. The snow crunches beneath my feet, heavy with responsibility. The snow crunches beneath my feet. We are more than disposable objects of desire. The snow crunches beneath my feet as I keep walking down this path, walking towards change, walking towards healing, walking for them, walking with them. The snow crunches beneath my feet. I listen to what it tells me, what it teaches me. I keep walking. So for me, whenever I come to these kind of talks, I carry these kind of stories with me, and I think about them throughout any of the talks and presentations, because that's why we're here, to have this conversation, to center the work that needs to be done, and especially that healing work that needs to be done within our communities. The stories and the numbers are stories, their lives and their people, Indigenous women, Indigenous relatives, Two-Spirit people, all contained within the settler colonial violence. And so for me, to be able to share space with you all to help have this conversation is part of the work that's necessary for us to continue on as Indigenous people. And I always keep them in my mind and in my heart as we have these conversations. So that's my why and what drives me into this work. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. Just to give folks a context, because this, because of our education system and the way the media portrays or doesn't, respond to our stories, to give you context of the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, our relatives, our Two-Spirit folks. Today, 4 out of 5 Indigenous women and people have experienced violence in their lifetime. Indigenous women and people go missing and are murdered at a rate 10 times higher than other groups of women. Our people are disappeared 3 times in life and death and in data. We connect the root of this cause to settler colonialism and heteropatriarchy acts of genocide against Indigenous people. Upon contact, colonizers disrupted cultural traditions of gender and sexual fluidity within Indigenous societies, severing kinship ties related to the land and spirituality that is central to Indigenous identity. The doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny justified genocides by means of military and religious imperialism to take the land and bodies as resources for labor and enslavement or worse. To accomplish this, Two-Spirit people were murdered and women and girls sexually trafficked, often forced into marriage with European settlers, diluting Native family lineages and absorbing their noble qualities to create a new Native American. Children were stolen from their families and sent to boarding school, which were actually labor camps. They were wrenched from their cultures, annihilating their language and kinship values of interdependence and reciprocal responsibility with the land and beings. Official acts of assimilation to civilized native peoples to kill the Indian and save the man. In the extermination of the Joyas, Deborah Miranda names the methods of murder, renaming, regendering, and replacement as the ways the Joya gendercide was carried out. Indigenous people were denied their ceremonial names and spiritual responsibilities, forced to assimilate to European cultural ideals of gender, which included how they dressed, and into disempowered gender-assigned roles. These acts are purposeful, systemic dispossession of Native people from their cultural responsibilities to humans, to other than humans, and lands and waters. Yet, as an act of resistance, we remain and continue to create healing for ourselves and our families and our communities. Speaking about these ongoing acts of erasure is important to the healing process, and our refusal to stay suspended in the damage and trauma are also acts of healing. We also live vibrant, creative lives because of the sacrifice as well as the generosity of our ancestors. We are responsible for sharing with our future generations, many of whom are here with us now in these times. As a place to start, let's talk about how Native identity is connected to land and other beings. Whoever feels like responding.
That's such a great question. I just actually seen a quote of my late Uncle John Trudell, who I know Rachel and I share joy in listening to his work. I seen a quote this morning actually that talked about how we're made of the same metals, minerals, and liquids of the earth, and how we're basically all creation is made of the same materials. And that's part of why we should be respecting not only each other, but our places within the world and with earth and with each other. And I'm really glad that that image was shared today on social media, because I was like, oh, that's such a good reminder. We're connected through those lands and waters in actually physical ways. And no matter where our ancestors are, we may not be made up of the same exact minerals and liquids because they're different depending on where you're from in the world. But I think about those kind of connections for Indigenous people and the responsibility that we carry with those teachings of how to live with the earth and to give back, and also to make sure that the earth is not being exploited alongside our own physical selves as well. And not just the earth, but the waters and plants and animals too. And I mean that very seriously. I don't mean it like as this like super mystical native lady talk. I mean it literally.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Luhui, and thank you, Renee, for the question. Just building off of that, you know, when I was growing up, I had relatives that talked about the fire, the rock, the water, and the green, and how there is an intelligence and an interaction that happens. And so I want to just uplift Luhui that our Indigenous life ways and knowledge are highly scientific. They've spoken to quantum physics. They have spoken to many forms of intelligences that, you know, many of us, we have that other practice, right? We go through many scientific articles and say, oh yeah, my auntie said that, or, you know, my relative talked about that in a ceremony before. And, you know, people will get surprised on how could we have known that, right, without the internet? Or how could we have known that without empirical evidence? And so I'm not against empirical evidence. You know, I really am thankful and supportive of it as a tool, and in the right context and into the right audience. And I just want to uplift that when we talk about identity too, there's different ways that we can articulate our identity. And, for me, some things I kind of forgot to share in my intro is I identify with being an Indigenous queer person on the journey of figuring out what it means to be a two-spirit people person from my cultural context, right? So there's roles and responsibilities that are actively being reclaimed. And so for me, another thing I say is, another thing that I like to say is my name. So my name is Shukmanatu Wichikala, and that was given to me or interpreted for me by a relative when I was coming into adulthood. And it was really important as a young person. I was going out into this world, and I had the opportunity to be named with my little sister. And that name that I shared, Shukmanatu Wichikala, little wolf, is something that I get to learn about every day of my life, and there's been a really beautiful journey through that experience, and also knowing that our spirits, it functions differently than just saying, oh, this is my title. These are the things that ground me in a colonial context, or give me power, or give me authority, or give me status. When I talk about how my ancestors can recognize that spirit of who I am, it kind of makes you really wonder what identity means and what's really important. So I'll maybe kind of start there, that that's something that I'm very grateful for in my life, is to have two parents as well that carry names of their own, and have shared with me just little pieces about their stories of what it took to get that part of their identity. And one of the things that I'm thankful for in ceremony sometimes is we can travel, our spirits can travel. And so we kind of have these either boundaries or protecting things. And so something that I like to do is, in my spiritual identity, is I'll repeat my name about 4 times sometimes, so that I know when I come back as a whole person. So I'm just gonna pass it back to you, Renee.
Thank you. Yeah, so I was just thinking about, two-spirit people were specifically targeted by settlers and the military and missionaries, the churches, and we talked about that. The Deborah Miranda writes about that in Bad Indians, and we also, some of our other community relatives and scholars, Dr. Coley Driscoll and others, it relates, they talk about the importance for two-spirit community in those intersections to gender and sexuality and but also nationhood as a, and that's part of a political act of reclaiming as well. Would you like to speak to that a little bit about, it's going a little bit further than connection to the land, but also, if, for example, where the two-spirit identifier comes from, maybe we can start there as a political act of reclaiming.
Do you want me to go, Rachel, or you want? Okay. So the term two-spirit itself emerged in 91 in Canada with a gathering of Indigenous folk who identified as part of the LGBTQ I2S plus community. But the reason why it came about is it wasn't just people from Canada. There was people from other areas too that identified as part of the community, is to reclaim not only the identities within Indigenous communities, but the cultural context for which those identities exist. So if somebody identifies as Two-Spirit, a lot of times people think that just means like you have both energies within yourself. That's true for some people, but for some people, it's also an identifier of their sexuality. And for some people, it's an identifier of their gender and their sexuality. And for some people, it's both or neither. And so just to make it confusing for people, that's what I like the whole idea of why Two-Spirit exists, because it doesn't fit within boxes. And because a lot of the LGBTQ plus identifiers have distinct like definitions of what that kind of means. In a lot of ways, some are more fluid than others, of course. That's part of why Two-Spirit was established, because for Indigenous people, it's more than just about your identity. It's also like part of your roles and responsibilities within your community that come with that identity, because everybody has roles and responsibilities dependent on what their identity is. So if you grew up in ceremony or culturally connected, or if you're relearning that, you'll see like there's certain roles that people play in communities. And so being able to have an identifier that has that cultural context allows those traditions that were interrupted, like how Renee was talking about, especially by religious systems and just straight out gendercide that happened in North America. And so I'll leave it at that and see if Rachel wants to add in, but it's really about that reclaiming the roles and responsibilities as well as the identity itself for most, but not all. So let's give the disclaimer. Some people do just use Two-Spirit as just an identity identifier too. So just to keep it simple for y'all. Go ahead, Rachel.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Luhui. And, you know, I think something that I really appreciate about this conversation, and, you know, I think there's a lot of questions that emerge, you know, so it's nice to see people asking questions and being curious about what does that mean, right? Like what does that actually feel like? And I think what's interesting is another question that I get sometimes with that is, you know, like who tells you that, or who gets to say you belong to that? And so I what I really like about, you know, being within the spectrum of a Two-Spirit person is that I feel like it brings a lot of conversation. You know, it asks us to be critical thinkers. You know, we're asked to live within a binary, either you're a woman or you're a man. And, you know, it's more complicated than that. And I think, you know, I'll uplift Theda Newbreast, who, you know, it was really affirming to hear that some of us are different, diverse tribal experiences. We have different knowledges. So some of us, we have star knowledge. And something that Theda Newbreast would say on talks that they gave at the Native Wellness Institute, shout out to all y'all out there, was, you know, as many stars there are genders to match. And so just kind of highlighting the diversity of expression, the diversity of how people understood what responsibilities meant. And I think that's something for me that, you know, growing up, you know, I don't want to make it like a fairy tale, you know, but I was very fortunate to have Two-Spirit people within my family who kind of, you know, they started asking those questions. They started making a way to really choosing that relational sovereignty of who they are and what their gifts were and what their roles were in our family. And so, I think something that's unique about my experience growing up is that actually one of the first people to have a more healthy partnership that I saw growing up was actually my Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer relatives who were, finding healthier partners, who were making commitments that fit within their life. And I think that's something that I like to tell people that, I got a slightly easier road or experience because my relatives started doing that work before I was born. And so that's really important, that not all of us are born or claim our biological families, or our biological families don't always claim us. And, there's something that for me, when I was kind of studying out more of this as I, went into college and even through high school, was finding examples that it's very natural for us to develop our gender expression and throughout our lifetimes. And so that, I think there are some, I don't want to put this one tribal nation on the blast, but there's a tribal nation who actually had, if you looked at them in some of the contemporary things that they did in their policy, you wouldn't know that actually they have very detailed gendered expressions for the development of children throughout their life. And so maybe you were born in this state, and as you developed, you actually made an agreement to follow certain roles through a gender expression for a while. And that it was very natural to have a pivoting or a built upon experience. And so that's something for me that I very much felt like that was my experience with my gender. And I still have a lot of fluidity, and I find it really interesting because I view it more as, at times, it feels like a trickster methodology where you really let other people kind of tell you about how they view the world by how they perceive you. And so, I'm a very generous person. That's something in my cultural values. And so I do my best to communicate with people with whom I feel safe and whom, I have protection, and let them know about, there's another way to think about something. And that's a gift that I think Two-Spirit and Indigenous and Indigiqueer people offer to the world, is for you to really assess where your beliefs come from. And unfortunately, we do have a lot of Christian influence that has impacted many of our Indigenous communities. And that was that gender side Renee was talking about. So, for me, I very distinctly remember my gender not matching the ways in which people expected me to behave. And I think that's a very personal journey. And yet I found reclamation through ceremonial settings to also not be dissuaded to learn the roles and responsibilities, that were set up by the people around me. And so for me, I kind of view it as being an even more skillful person, knowing that there's responsibilities that come with kind of each identity. And so for me, I enact trickster methodology in certain contexts to say, I know why and when and how to look and view people in a way that is, going to either help me survive, or it's going to help me and the communities thrive. And so maybe that's where I'll pause and see if there's any expansion.
I love that, Rachel. Thank you. Especially, I was thinking when you said the trickster methodology, it was like, that's so reflective of the terminology itself, because it's like people think it's one thing, but it's so many things, right? And it depends on the person and the context and your peoples and how colonization has impacted your people. So Renee's conversation earlier that talked about Deborah Miranda's work with the extermination of the Hoyas, that was for my father's people in California specifically. And she writes about Aki people and the roles and responsibilities of Aki people within our community. And I was just like, that was a very life-changing article for myself. And Yeah, so I would say that to add on to it, because I named a term that coincides with a cultural context with Aki, that Two-Spirit was never intended to be a replacement for those terms within our communities, nor was it intended to stop us from recovering those languages and those identities within the cultural context too. So some people use both depending on where you're at, and some people use one and not the other. And so just say that, again, reflecting on what Rachel said about the trickster methodology, it's so contextual of an identity, and also the in that it's very much so that it's a placeholder for some as we're reclaiming identities within our communities. And it gives us a way for there to be a unifier term that people know, like, okay, that's at least have an idea of like within a realm of how somebody identifies if they use the term. So it's a unifier word as well.
I think that there's a question that I think you both answered, but I'll just put it out here. So is it appropriate for mixed Indigenous queers to identify as Two-Spirit within their Indigenous community while also using LGBT identifiers within non-Indigenous communities? Is there anything we should know about current movements and social issues that discuss the ethics of being an Indigenous queer within modern settler environments?
That's a long question.
Yeah.
It's a set of questions.
Should I
Yeah,
read?
also I forgot to mention that too when we first asked Renee, is Two-Spirit is not for non-Indigenous people. It's a term that's only for Indigenous people. And the reason why is like a lot of people are like, oh, that's such a beautiful term. It is a beautiful term, and so is the whole meaning behind it and all the things that come with it. And so that it's something for people to keep in mind, that that term is reserved for Indigenous people. And a lot of people do use both, whether within the larger LGBTQ plus community or not. And some people use terms within those labels as well, and some people don't. Again, it's so contextual, and there's a lot to be said about that last part, the current movement and social issues. Like, I don't know if we should answer that now, or because I know there's other things we want to talk. What do you think, Rachel? That's a long conversation.
Well, I'm really glad that there's big minds and big hearts out there. And, I think it is important to go back to that aspect of, also looking at history. Like, history really matters in the pursuit of justice, of reclaiming our identities for our communities, right? Like, there's this experience of some of our tribal nations, we may have to be relying on the anthropological documents taken by white cis hetero men. And it's really interesting to think about, who did they have access to, right? And so sometimes you'll see in different texts like a focus on, oh, just men that were acting as women, right? And so for Lakota people, we have winktes and people that act in a certain way, right? And so their roles and responsibilities or their gifts. And so I think it's like important to just acknowledge moments of, settler colonialism has ruptured many of our knowledge systems. I won't say it's impossible. I think that there are people who do that work, and they dedicate their life to doing that work. So I never want to erase that possibility. But I will say that they're very ruptured at times from my own experience, and that it's okay to grieve if you don't have access to your community's history, and to really keep an eye out and an open heart and an open mind to finding those relatives that are. There's certain ceremonies that people still have access to where they can ask these kind of questions, right? And so when people kind of give me those kind of questions, sometimes I want to just tell them, like, I see you and I love you. And I hope that, you know, you find those things and know that, like, you know, our creation, our creator's teachings that many of us get in many ways are all about love, right? They're all about saying, you know, and I had a relative one time tell me, because I was saying, like, oh, I'm so scared to be this queer Indigenous person in this certain setting. And, or I'm afraid they won't like me or accept me or love me. And then they're like, oh, yeah, I hear you. That sounds like a lot of fear. They're like, I don't know why you're forgetting that. Like, the creator loves you. Creation loves you. In creation, there are what we would call queer or varying, you know, if you're going to use a Western thing, like deviant expressions that, like, they challenge that binary, right? And they call it deviant because it challenges that status quo. It challenges the ability to dominate and subjugate other people. And so, you know, I always love the opportunity to encourage people to be really humble and be really honest, you know, take that time to invest in getting to know yourself, and don't miss that opportunity to appreciate those that may have that experience. You know, I can't say that every, you know, Two-Spirit or Indigenous queer person is going to find all the specifics that they need, but there are relatives whose ancestors or relatives, they did share that knowledge with them. And so it's really important to not get in that deficit mind thinking too, of saying, like, I'm not enough, and if someone has more than me, then it's a threat to me, or it means that I'm less than. You know, maybe you make an offering and you study with that person. Maybe you ask them to be your mentor, or maybe you just listen to them and hear about what it took to be that kind of responsible relative, and see if you're up for it, you know? So that's just something that I like to share with others who, you know, are kind of asking those kind of questions is, you know, we're really asking, am I enough? Am I going to be loved? Is it okay for me to be myself? Is what I hear. So I don't want to misinterpret, but it's some things that I hear when people ask those questions. And so, you know, maybe I'll kind of frame it that way for you all.
There's another question here. Thank you for that. It's part of our healing, this offering that we make in this conversation today too. And another guest wrote that as they're learning about settler colonialism and the, you know, practices and impacts, the perpetuation of the violence against Indigenous people, women and Two-Spirit people, why is this still happening?
So many reasons. There's a lot.
Yeah.
It's in the violence against Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people in particular. It began with, like, contact, and it's well documented, like, why our bodies were attacked. Not only because we weren't viewed as human, but also because our existence as political leaders and as negotiators and healers and all the things, roles that come with our identities that are, of course, contextual by the people that people are a part of. But all of those structures were a threat to the colonizing mindset and structures where men, especially, like, what we call cisgender men, which is like somebody who identifies as a man who is sex assigned at birth as male. That's considered what cisgender is for folk who don't know. So cisgender European men who were also Christian and had certain belief systems, it was very patriarchal, like men are in charge, the head of governments, the head of all the things. When they arrived and seen Two-Spirit people and Indigenous women with that kind of power within their communities, it was a threat to what they wanted to bring here. And so that's when those attacks started. And because, in all honesty, the settler state we live in is still built around those same foundations that are written into the founding documents and everything, we're still a threat because we're a reminder of what's possible and like how things should actually happen on our own lands. And so that's like the meta picture. And then like to narrow it down, there's a bunch of laws and policies in place that make the violence continue impossible. And so when you narrow it down to like who has jurisdiction, where the funding goes for searches and all of those things, and you couple that with the way that especially Indigenous women are depicted by popular media as just these objects of desire that are to be cast aside, that's embedded in pop culture, Halloween costumes, music videos, cartoons. They reframe the whole Pocahontas story as well as Sacagawea as like grown women when they were children being trafficked. And so the way that our entire stories are reframed impact how we're viewed now, alongside stereotypes of like when people go missing, oh, you know how Native women are, they just like to party, or they're just like out doing their thing and they'll be back eventually, and kind of that kind of mentality where people don't prioritize looking for people. And so all of those things combined, like the contextual history piece, like that big picture, we're still a threat to the settler states, the governing structure, basically, even though we have women now in like the settler governing structures. It's a different type of structure than our traditional ways of being are. And then you have all the other things as well that impact our lived experiences on a daily. That's what I got for that one.
Yeah. Well, and I think about it like just building off of all that brilliance there, is whether you want to call it systemic this, systemic that, there's this scholar, Dr. Amanda Tashini, and what I really like about their work, they're going to be releasing a book soon, but their dissertation is really rocking. But there's kind of some things about kind of going into some of our traditional stories about monsters, right? Or going into our traditional stories about the embodiment of something evil or something that consumes, something that is so horrific, right? Something that you're like, geez, they take our people and they eat them up, or they cause a lot of distress, or they cause grief. And what's really beautiful about their work is kind of naming these monsters, right? So many of our Indigenous cultures, and I just want to, if you're new to, this conversation, that we have over 500 and I think it's 74 now, 73, 74 diverse tribal nations within the United States, and acknowledging that there are many more. A lot of confederation happened, so grouping of Indigenous peoples. And so I think about how our Indigenous peoples talked about these monsters, right? Or these spirits, or some people might call them hungry ghosts, or things that never satiated, and I think about systemic monsters as, yes, they're the interlocking structures rooted in this white supremacy, right? Rooted in settler colonialism, racism, anti-Blackness, heteropatriarchy, capitalism. And what it does is it disrupts our ability to be sovereign. So our inherent right to self-govern or to be self-determinating with our peoples about how we want to create and be in belonging. So sometimes I like to reference their work of saying, I'm getting more comfortable creating unbelongingness to the settler nation state. I do not want to belong. I do not want to assimilate and normalize being okay with the status quo, because it is unhealthy. It is fundamentally anti-Indigenous and anti-Black. The whole founding of this country. And you can look at the Federalist Papers if you're really wanting specifics. Also, Kyle T. Mays does amazing work around the specifics of and the intersectionality of anti-Blackness and anti-Indigeneity. Something else about when we look at monsters sometimes in these stories is that, or why we even get scared of things like shape-shifting. You know, I talk about tricksters and some people are like, oh no, all tricksters are bad, or they're just naughty, or it's scary. And I like to, you know, I like to lean into that. Again, it tells you about people. But I also do think that there were behaviors that came from these interlocking structures, right? And I think that shape-shifting, kind of talking about how something scary can shape and kind of fool us into thinking that it's good, right? Or it's desirable, or it's beautiful even. And so I think about that a lot, actually, about how colonialism, settler colonialism specifically, and white supremacy are very good at shape-shifting. They're very good at being hidden in our diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, right? Even within a settler educational system or a nonprofit. And really it's morphing in various ways with deep intentions to maintain power over land and peoples. And so that's ultimately, when you look at how settler colonialism looks in our modern day, you know, it has shape-shifted, right? And so when Luhui was talking about it's in laws, it's in policies, it's in practices, if you can find any comfort, something I find comfort in is that it's very predictable, actually. But our lenses sometimes, or our ability to see those specific morphings, are why we need a consciousness of a trickster, or we need a consciousness that can hold many lenses, or can see that doesn't feel right. And so I'm going to name that monster. I'm going to name that monster of erasure in media of Indigenous peoples and the diversity of Indigenous peoples, right? Coming from a Lakota background, a plains-based background, you know, you see pan-Indigenism everywhere. And I think it is good to, you know, again, unite over things that are affirming, or have these, you know, humorous cultural contexts that we can all kind of, you know, find comfort with each other, or have humor. But there's another level of when you're able to name that deep intention, right? So that thing is morphing, and it's morphing so that it can maintain power over lands and peoples, right? And so I think that's just something to keep in mind, that it, you know, it keeps me up at night sometimes, thinking of all the ways like in which the morphing has happened. And I still think that that's why we need our Two-Spirit and queer Indigenous peoples, who have, you know, we can look at the trauma side and say, oh, you've gathered so much trauma, or here's all this really sad information about your community, all that you can't do under these structures. And that's why we're here to say, look at all that we can do, and look at all that we are doing, and look at how we have code switched through English, you know? And so I have used other LGBTQIA and Two-Spirit terms in other spaces to let people know, like, this is where my orientation is at, you know, in my journey of developing. Some of it is very secure, and some of it, as I've learned more, or learned through English language, this is how I want people to treat me, or this is who I am attracted to or want to be in community with. And letting people know that there's some accountability that I have, that there are certain experiences that I don't have as well. And so that's just something, you know, monsters are important to name and to recognize, and also know that we are not without our own monsters. You know, we all can have a connection to monsters or be monsters ourselves. In my community context, Toka is our own inner enemy. So each of us sometimes may be called through our own inner enemy to be complicit or to see a monster, and maybe we don't have the skills or the words to say, hey, that's a monster and it's hurting people, right? And so there's a lot of things around, you know, not shaming people when we don't have language, in a language that is very inherently violent. And so, you know, just wanted to uplift, looking into old stories of whoever your people are, looking into how they viewed and what people did to overcome monsters or protect themselves from monsters, or you know, to help other people see how much they morph. So yeah.
Thank you for that. There's a couple of other questions here. Are there generational differences of those on the panel and being able to be openly Two-Spirit more in the post-colonial world than in tribal communities? Should I read it again?
No, I'm reading it. I'm just trying to it's it's an interesting question. I don't know about the generational differences more than just the time period in which language is being reclaimed. You know what I mean? In how people are in their own families or within their own communities and what that means. And so I think that it's less about a post-colonial, because it's not post. There's we look like settler colonial systems, aka the settler state, also known as the United States, literally lives right on top of our existing indigenous worlds. It's active colonization, it's not post, but that's just my take on it. And our tribal communities are also impacted heavily by that coexistence with the settler state and the systems that come with it. And there's if we're talking about the sad parts, right, the highest suicide rate with queer youth is Indigenous youth. And that's because of the transphobia and the homophobia that still exists within our own communities. And how Rachel was talking about earlier, how people don't know if they'll be kicked out of their families, or actually a lot of people are ostracized by their peers. Where do you go? Or even not knowing how to exist within an identity that has been pushed aside for so long within communities, and what it means to be one of the people that reclaims those identities. And so I think that's how I'm looking at that question. It's less about being openly Two-Spirit, or whether or not somebody is ready to accept the roles and responsibilities that come with that identity as well. And so there's a lot that goes into it. I think sometimes, like most people, things get overthought too, right? And so sometimes there's so much thought into putting with it because it's such a big responsibility. I'm thinking about some of the work that I'm doing with my tribe in California about some of the stuff with the Kalnagpra and what it means to be able to reclaim some key traditions within grave repatriations, and what that means, because that's heavily connected to that identity. And so there's a lot to unpack with that. That's why I was pausing for a minute and thinking, because I think part of it's generational, but a lot of it has to do with having the words too now. in people's comfort levels with where they are in life and how that impacts relationships. I think that that's why I'm looking at it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, at least to kind of speak from being able to, a blessing that happened during this COVID time, this like pandemic, was, being able to connect more with, I know for myself, more queer, Indigenous, and Two-Spirit people. And I think the humility of really seeing that, because of the suicide rates, because of the rates of lack of proper health care as well. So going into a medical facility and assuming that you will be treated as a human being with, physiological needs, is not something that I feel like Two-Spirit and LGBTQ relatives have gotten in our current Western medical system. And so, sitting down and talking with Two-Spirit elders, or people who are over the age of 45 or who make it to 65, I believe there are statistics around Indigenous people. There's some amazing people doing Indigenous health equity work in the room and in attendance, but our health rates of how old we are under these traumatic oppressive systems is also, it impacts our age in which we get to become an elder or become older in this society. And so I think, just something to add is I'm very careful to approach my elder Two-Spirit people because of the trauma that is very real, and even in our Indigenous communities or Afro-Indigenous communities, which, if you're unfamiliar, Lumbee people, we are Afro-Indigenous peoples as well, mixed with settler ancestors and living on a coastline with so much history and so much violence that happened. I just really wanted to speak to that, and also know that, I have my own experiences with, people who were both excited. That's why I give them that respect and I acknowledge what they've gone through, because, and that's part of that trauma that I try to hold compassion and graciousness with, is saying, I see you and thank you. Because I have also had elders who have said, oh, it's so easy for you, or you're so spoiled because you don't know how hard it is. And so I do my best to muster empathy in those moments and just really center them in their moment of, they need something, or there's a part that's unhealed. And so all I can do sometimes is really acknowledge that and not get defensive or say, that's not, that's just your trauma, and walk away. It's really different when you live through experiences of being a darker skinned Indigenous person, right? Within, that's something, even in my own sibling kinship, we are melanated at various rates or degrees, right? And that's something that, it took us a long time until we grew older for me to say, like, this is what that trauma felt like to experience in a rural town in Oregon, And I think there's something that, like, that experience for me is why I will pivot, and I'll listen to my Two-Spirit elders when they say, this is what happened. And this is how hard it was. And for me, all I hear is, this is why I must love and I must continue to heal as long as I can, as long as I have on this earth. That is, so that as I have other Two-Spirit and Indigenous queer youth looking at, maybe they're looking at Luhui or they're looking at me for answers, that I have something to offer them. And so I'll do my best. And, and sometimes, yeah, I haven't always I haven't always been that way, where sometimes I would get offended and be like, what a hater, eh? Geez, they got a bad mood. And until, I kind of got those experiences of listening and doing more healing work with myself and other people, and also like leaning into seeing Two-Spirit elders who have done and are so embodied, right? Because we can get in this thing of like, how do you know? Or like this lack feel of like, who gets to say what's this? I am always more curious about people that embody their full spirit. And you feel it when they walk into a room. You feel it when they speak on a microphone at a powwow, introducing themselves. And it must be so scary. Or there might have been some scary, traumatic things. But what they share or how they make you feel is not scary and traumatic. It's beautiful. It is such an experience that I hope to have that impact on other people, so that's maybe how I'll approach that question.
I love that, Rachel. You're reminding me of my interviews from my dissertation when, because my research was on intergenerational storytelling in a very specific way with Indigenous activism. And the whole point was to recenter Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people's stories, because like, if you really look at what's documented, how Rachel said earlier, it's from a certain lens, and even with our own writing, sometimes centers Indigenous men who, of course, were doing the work too, but there was also Two-Spirit people and women doing the work alongside them. And some of those interviews with Two-Spirit elders, I was just blown away with how powerful their work was and how like hidden it is from people. And then like, we really need to recover those stories because they're part of it all. And even with Deborah Miranda's work, she did a lot of archival work on Kipsipaiwit, who was a Shumasha key person. He's the one who retold how to build a tamol, and that story was what helped my dad and my uncles bring back our tamols in the 70s. And so that was relying very specifically on the Akit traditions within my Chumash people of record keeping and retelling these stories for generations. He didn't know it was going to be like how many years later, generations later, that his story, he was just living how he was supposed to. And it led to the entire revitalization of our tamols, our canoes, or their ocean going canoes, just so you all know what they are. And that led to that revitalization in the 70s that's now thriving to this day. And so if it wasn't for those ancestors and elders to help bring all this together for us, like we wouldn't be here. And I think those stories are incredibly powerful and incredibly undertold and not really well understood, because everybody looked at Kipsipaiwit and was like, he was just this man that was telling stories and weaving baskets. And that wasn't who he was. He was much more than that.
And just a final note on that is there is a difference in my mind to elders and then olders, right? You can age and you can choose not to heal and gain a quantifiable number. And I still think that there's wisdom and knowledge in that, even our most unhealed older people have a lot to offer us. But I do like to kind of uplift that sometimes, that just because you are older doesn't mean that you are an elder always. Or maybe we look into the specific language of why is someone, what elder status means to a tribal community or to a tribal nation. And so I just like to be really careful about that, because there are predators out there who claim eldership. And I call those people olders. I say they are older, but they are not an elder. And so I like to just kind of put that out there for people to think about.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for, I think you answered several questions that folks had. So thank you for that. And Rachel, you touched on this a little bit, and One of the questions is Black Indigenous women seem to have no status. There's never any conversation regarding Black Indigenous women. Why is that? And so I'm going to also expand that a little bit to our Afro-Indigenous relatives, and then kind of transition us into the projects that Linda Joy Smith would name it as the projects that our people in our communities are creating, what they're enacting, what they're embodying for healing settler colonial impact, and also to protect our people.
Renee, it's not really clear on this question if they're talking about like status with MMIW, MMIR work, or if they just mean in general. And so I would appreciate you helping us frame it a little bit. How, and I do want to add in too, like people are probably like, we have been talking about Two-Spirit people most of the time, and like, what does that have to do with MMIW and MMIR? Has everything to do with it, actually. It's really important for us to understand our own communities, to understand how to protect ourselves, and to understand that this violence is deeply embedded. And part of what we wanted to do was not only focus on the trauma today, but also like the healing pieces. And so I wanted to make sure we mentioned that in case anybody was confused. And just to give a short like stat drop, there's not any stats on Two-Spirit people that are murdered and missing, because people get misgendered all the time, and they get misraced all the time. And so maybe we can frame that one for that question. Is that okay?
Yeah,
Renee?
that's great. Thank you.
So to tie those two together, so there's the misgendering that happens where people, if they're looking for a trans Indigenous woman and people are looking for them, they might be listed with the NamUs list, which is the national what do you call them? Missing persons system thing. If they're listed as a man on there, people aren't looking for the right person. And so it's incredibly damaging. And especially when people, community or families purposely change it to how they think somebody should identify with, when that's not their lived experience in life, because you're not looking for the same person anymore. And so that kind of complexity is important to talk about. The same thing happens with Black Indigenous women that go missing, as well as people who myself who would easily get classified as Latinx on stats because I'm not from a federally recognized tribe, and I wouldn't be being looked at or looked for just like somebody that is classified as a Black Indigenous woman will be listed under the Black statistics and data sets. So that's how I would say approach it, is that there's a couple things happening, especially with MMIW and MMIR work, is that the misracing is extremely prevalent, just like the misgendering is. And there's also the reality of anti-Blackness within our communities that needs to get addressed, as well as like who belongs in community. And we still have some healing to do in that regard, just like we do with Two-Spirit people. So I think that that those are incredibly tied together. And until we do that healing work within our communities and interrupt those systematic pieces like missing persons data and get things corrected, like we have to do both of those to help address both issues. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it kind of goes back to some of those monsters we talked about, right? And one of the biggest monsters that I still feel will appear in our community is that monster of not enoughness, right? And that's why that healing work is so important, right? And so I am, when I say things like, why aren't these people, or they're not having conversations, again, I need to look for those leaders that have been there, right? And so just because you may not see it in a certain place, looking for where and who those leaders are and what is happening, you know. And And I think it's interesting because there are a lot of Indigenous and Black communities who have long histories together, right? And what's missing, or that grief comes up again when I hear questions like this, is that we need more systemic teachings by our communities about our histories, okay? We need our histories by our communities to be systemic. And so that is part of the call forward, you know, of bringing our whole selves and bringing this work into these spaces for other relatives, right? So if you're an elder, you know, what are you going to be sharing with the youth, or what contributions? Or if there are Afro-Indigenous youth and Black and Indigenous youth stepping forward, are you supporting them, right? And so that's just something that, I don't know, this question is really, you know, it's important to address, you know, especially as we talk about shadeism. You know, that's something that in our classroom space, I do make space for that with certain courses that I teach, because there were very specific policies that either incentivized our own communities to deny either our indigeneity or to deny our Black and African ancestors, you know? And so I know for some of the Lumbee people and others, there was what they would call the pencil test. And so the pencil test was, you were considered Black if you could stick a pencil in your hair and it stayed. And that's an example of then the shaming of our skin, the shaming of our hair, and that creates that monster of not enoughness or too much of something that is undesirable. And so, you know, it is really, it's really important to talk about these monsters, you know, and sometimes they show up in our own questions too, of like, you know, we're kind of focusing today, and, you know, for those of you who have a gift bag, something that I like to do, that some of you all got a little spray of some tangerine spray. And sometimes I have to enact certain senses and take really deep breaths and really find what my question is about. And sometimes I check in and I realize I have a monster with me. And that monster is real because we have people in our own community who are feeding those monsters, you know? And that's that whole kind of divide and conquer, and, oh, but we don't like that because, you know, it's too dark or it's unfavorable. And, you know, that's a very personal story in my own family was, you know, people were so happy for me because they're like, you got good hair, right? They're like, you're not too dark and you got that good hair. And they were relieved for me. And yet those kind of things are really painful. And also for my cousins who didn't escape that, turning that love and attention to them and saying, I see you. And I won't be able to understand certain things that happen in your life. And those are those kind of conversations that, you know, our communities, we need sacred study time to talk about anti-Blackness and why certain tribal communities chose to be on the side of oppressor and also oppress our Black relatives through slavery. We became monsters to mimic a system. Now, all of us, it's really important to get specific about which tribal nations, which regions, which time in history. And also know that throughout history, many of us, we've ended up in various places, right? So having that compassion of knowing history and knowing self and being able to be very specific so that you don't feed a monster that says, oh, these people are just anti-Black or these people are just anti-Indigenous. We all have complex tensions that have happened while we have been trying to survive colonialism. And so I just want to uplift anyone in this room in this moment and say, I'm always happy to talk about it. I'd love to be in community. I do my best in the spaces that I am a part of to have those conversations, but they are needed. They are needed systemically. They are needed more. We need more people. And so when I get questions like this too, I'm like, none of us should be bored. Like there's so much work to do. And so just thank you though. Thank you for being brave and asking these questions in this space. And I apologize for any offense or incompleteness just on my side as a panelist, because there's a lot of grieving and there's a lot of things to be upset about in this system. So.
There's one more question here in the chat. There's a couple of things that have come up recently with the Supreme Court. And one of them is an act, the Puerto Rican Self-Determination Act that went to the floor based on a Supreme Court decision that ruled against a Puerto Rican elder who was receiving benefits while living in New York. So he was considered a citizen while he was in New York, but when he went back to his home island, he was no longer a citizen. And so they were denying his rights. But the Supreme Court ruled against him. And of course, Justice Sotomayor, who is Puerto Rican, and has written a lot about this situation for Puerto Rican relatives, but also Supreme Court Justice, in his opinion, it was a 10-page opinion where he named racism and settler colonialism or colonialism in the Constitution, but also in the precedent cases that they are kind of forced to use. And he signaled that he has not been asked to consider those issues in making a ruling. And then also the question in the chat was about the potential decision around abortion care access and this issue in that it was part of the genocide against Indigenous people and people of color and communities of color, and we've seen that in the last couple of years. It still continues, this issue of forced sterilization. And so I think that we've touched on these issues without directly addressing those questions, but this is a way of erasing, of removing, of getting rid of our people and stopping. They're trying to stop our futures, and there's always, it comes down to having access to land, and keeping the status quo, keeping the settler state in control. And so I want to, because we're right at the 3:30 mark, and so I'd like to move us in the direction of talking about healing practices in our community, the ways that we create healing, activism, as and the English language, so activism as a site of resistance, and some of the language maybe around, being called a protester in as opposed to a protector. So leaning more towards how we create healing sites of resistance as healing actions, if you'd like to speak to that.
Can you give me the question part again, Renee?
Okay.
Because I was reflecting on everything you said, and I was like, which part do I want to Thank you.
Yes. So what are some sites of resistance that that our communities are enacting and embodying to help heal this missing and murdered Indigenous women relative to spirit crisis? Let me start there.
I think one of the things that is barely, it feels like it's barely happening, that really needs to continue to grow, is holding people accountable that are causing harm within communities. Because a lot of times people are like, what do we do? There's so much work to do. Usually people know something, and a lot of times people don't speak up. And that's incredibly unfortunate and devastating in addressing the MMIW, MMIR crisis. And so even having more people speak up and intervene while people are being trafficked or when they go missing, or knowing who's bringing meth and fentanyl into our communities, being able to intervene, those things isn't just only addressing some of the conditions that are set that make MMIW crisis continue, but it is also helping our community heal in general, because those are significant issues that impact our communities. So I think that accountability piece, continuing to grow that, and knowing that it's from a place of care and love. I appreciate you bringing that up earlier, Rachel, that love piece, we just being able to bring that, understanding where it's coming from. That's not to get people in trouble and to tell on people. It's literally to help save lives in our communities as a whole. I think we need to continue to do more of that kind of resistance kind of work, whether it's in the urban areas or within tribal communities, because it's a widespread issue. And so that's where my mind went immediately with this one, because it's so incredibly interconnected, and just also bringing our community in more together. We heavily talked about Two-Spirit identities today, and talked about some of the sad parts of why we really need to understand what it means, and try to interrupt those really colonial practices of exclusion based on people's identities as well. There's a lot of healing to do in that regard. And I'm slowly seeing things like powwows being more inclusive, and saying Two-Spirit relatives are welcome to dance in whatever category you want to. And I know we do that here at our powwow, and there's other ones too in tribal communities, but that's not the norm yet. So I look at those as little tiny moments of healing that just are incredibly powerful. And I always think about how beautiful would it be if we just embraced those practices, whether it's holding people accountable or just remembering to welcome people in to our ceremony and our cultural spaces, how much healing that could do. I'll pause for now.
Yeah. I think there's, I'm seeing some questions too of well, how do I reconnect to my Indigenous people or my indigeneity? And just uplifting Kyle T-Mays again around, there was an indigeneity as well with African people when they came, when we came, our ancestors came to these lands too. And there are actually really affirming things that I'd like to uplift in the Afro-Indigenous people's history of the United States, is kind of tracking of, when our communities are asked to give up that indigeneity or a way of being and thinking and being place-based people. And kind of thinking about this quote by Bell Hooks, and I'll just read it directly. It's from their book, All About Love. And contemplating death has always been a subject that leads me back to love. Significantly, I begin to think more about the meaning of love as I've witnessed the deaths of many friends, comrades, and acquaintances, many of them dying young and unexpectedly. Page 22, I think. So, and just holding that space for each other of, when we're grieving, thinking about those people who show up in our life, right? What kind of relatives are we going to be to each other? And I have been very blessed in my life to have an amazing support system of people who have come forward and reminded me who I am in those moments in which you don't know which way to go or if the healing is worth it. And so sometimes I say, like, it's hard, but it's worth it, or what's right isn't always easy. And it's worth it, And I think in that kind of frame, just something I'm thinking about with, like, there's many ways to heal. One of my elders always said, healing is healing. And so it can look like many different things. And some things we can't ever be completely healed from, but we can still experience a healing, and that's kind of touching on, one of the relatives that's in my family, Fool's Crow, around, sometimes we can't completely heal something, and yet there's still an opportunity to experience and create a healing for maybe someone who can. And so that's just something I really think about, and knowing that each generation, like when we look at what is justice, I think every generation has the opportunity to live justice, to break open and protect the things that are most precious to us. And so when these kind of like, oh, here's another morphing of a monster, right? Of, taking away the ability for people to choose, or who gets to control bodies and who gets to make policies around land and bodies. Like, that's what I see as this monster. And I think, there is a generational call of, we can't do it alone. And so I believe that coalition building is really essential to justice, being strategic and being systemic. And part of that, to me, is we having conversations together. And so when we say, what are those things that get in the way of us being able to build coalitions? Sometimes it's conflict resolution, or sometimes it's our aversion to conflict. Sometimes it's our inability to navigate our own emotions because our spirits or our minds or our bodies are so impacted. And so that's why, some of the things that have healed me have been Indigenous language and singing, because it literally changed my brain. And being on land and being in a state of, as much as we're talking about the deficit, what does it feel like to be whole then? What does it feel like to be healed? Because I can tell you all day, you need to heal, you need to heal. Some elders heal, some elders don't heal. But what does that look like? And what does that feel like? What does it taste like? And so for some of us, healing is when we eat our foods, our first foods. Sometimes it's just drinking water. having people in your life. I had a student earlier that texted me, make sure you get your big old cup of water. And I was like, oh, thank you. Like, that was so healing to accept and know that I created a support system of loving, caring people. Like, that was a really big healing moment for me, and something as simple in a text message. And so I just want to like uplift that part and say, thank you to each person that's, listened so graciously today. And that's why I really want to uplift Okosia Red Elk's yoga that will happen at the end of yoga sessions that will happen at the end of the week again. Really encourage you to take that time to activate your body's highly intelligent mechanisms, to activate hormones and experiences of joy and of embodiment, to actually move through the trauma and keep yourself flexible. And if that's not something in your bodyscape for that particular day, or you have some things that maybe that's not the practitioner, whatever it is, there's many ways that we can find a movement or be moved very deeply in our spirit and in our mind. So whatever that is, I just want to encourage you to keep taking care of yourselves, and thank you so much for listening today.
I was going to add into, like, you're reminding me of all the little things that healing feels like, right? Like, so like to find what healing feels like to you. I remember I was like in one of my own modes and somebody was like, when was the last time you laughed? I was like, and stuff like that, where people are, there's people that remind you, like, you seem like you need to work on some things sometimes. And also recognizing that our communities, as well as other trauma impacted communities, know what trauma feels like, and healing may be unfamiliar. And that has a lot to do with some of the mental health and addiction issues within our communities, is that coping piece, and like not understanding, like, or not necessarily understanding, but the unfamiliarity that healing feels like for some people, because of being used to trauma and being used to all the other things that come along with it, because of how colonization has impacted our communities. It's like the generational kind, not just like something happened one day. And so, like, when your family and your people and your community has been living with trauma, that healing part can be hard. And the reconnection piece to ceremony and the other pieces that may feel like healing to you. If you're in that mode, like anybody listening, just keep trying to feel that healing, and understand that it's okay that it feels different, and that is in itself part of the healing in general. I just really wanted to bring that in.
Yeah, thank you both so much. As we're kind of approaching the end of today's panel, would you like to offer some calls to action that folks can consider? Calls to action to help address the issue of MMIW, missing murdered Indigenous women relatives, our Two-Spirit folks.
I would say that we're waiting for some systematic change ever so patiently. Federal law and policy needs to change, but I think right now what we need is some tangible efforts too, like that are going to directly impact families and help recover people. And some of that has to do with the things that I mentioned earlier, with intervening with the source of all of it, like why are people being abducted, why are people being killed, and addressing those issues within whatever community they exist. It's like systematic and widespread across the entire continent, right? It's not just like the United States, it's not just Oregon, it's like Canada and Mexico and the United States all in this together. But like on a smaller scale, what you can do is just really intervening and helping when the call out comes. I know sometimes people are scared to speak up because they feel threatened, or there are actually threats happening because of involvement of things like cartels and other trafficking rings. But it's really incredibly important to interrupt the conditions being set. Like we need to change those conditions, because law and policy takes a really long time to change, and the reports are going to take a while to interpret. And in the meantime, we have missing people like literally right now. There's searches going on somewhere. And so I think finding those pieces, like we need those kind of action item steps in the meantime that we can work on. So for me, that would be like a call for action is like, what can you do now? And how can you intervene those conditions being set? And I gave you a couple of examples. And also work on the law and policy piece too, for the long haul.
Yeah, definitely. And just kind of, sorry, I have to plug in this computer. uh, so really just wanting to connect back to, you know, there are many people doing this work, right? So we've uplifted MMIW USA, who does direct support services to families going through the most awful times, right? And so really you can financially support. I also think about people who are, you know, we've said things before around like, well, educate yourself, right? But I am actually more on the line now of saying, I'm more interested in what you're willing to unlearn. And so the really nuanced ways that those monsters of consumption, like, oh, I just want to consume Indigenous peoples, or I want to consume all the readings by Indigenous people. I want you to slow down and chew your food. Take each reading, take each speaker, take each moment and digest it. Find that medicine. We're all imperfect people and we only have so much time in the Zoom world to speak. But I'm really interested in how can I unlearn that settler mindset of extracting from others or dehumanizing others. That's really for me what I'm more interested in. And I think it can be really powerful to motivate you to dedicate your life to supporting that policy work, to supporting yourself, to listen, listen so that, we have this joke in institutional spaces. I have to say things 3 to 5 times just in my positionalities for people to hear me. What can you unlearn so that if you hear an Afro-Indigenous person, or you hear an Indigenous woman, or you hear a Two-Spirit person say, help, I am suffering. I need you to help me in these ways. Maybe you can't do systemic work, but you might have someone specific in your life say, I'm suffering. This is what I need support or resources for. And you can do it that way. And you can demonstrate not just being someone who's going to tokenize us who have survived colonialism. And you can really put the resources, whatever that is. It might be your time, your energy. Maybe you have privileges that you can access. And it also know that it's really harmful for us to have to say, we need your privilege, right? That liberation that we're asking for is that we don't have to beg for resources anymore. We don't have to beg to be heard. It just is. And so those are those things that I really want to say is like, for me, after doing so many years of this work with others, is I say, I want to know what you're willing to unlearn to motivate you to, as one student of mine said, kill the settler, save the human. I was like, geez, that's hardcore. But I loved it so much because it wasn't talking about actually, I'm not proposing that you actually cause violence or kill or harm anyone else, but that mindset of something that only takes that monster that is conditioned within all of us, and know that we are connected to it. All of us have behaviors that are a part of our landscapes or bodies now. And so that's just something I want to keep on asking is keep asking questions, learn how to work with others. And if you don't have those skills, learn from others or support them and ask for explicit help when you need it. So thank you for listening, and hopefully you can hear that it's the first time around, and if not, there's the recording. So
I'm just gonna throw in there, like, we have all this work to do, and I just want to reemphasize, like, there's literally people who need us to intervene though. Like, please do what you can and intervene, even if it sounds scary. Like, people need that intervention right now. Like, they need the support. There's the cases, or I work with MMIW USA a lot, and just knowing what's coming this year, it's gonna be gnarly. It already is, and they need help, like, not just them, but the other groups that are doing the work. And I did want to say, because sometimes people get nervous about financial contributions and stuff like that, if it's helpful or eases anybody's mind, their financial contributions go directly to search efforts. So search efforts, supporting families in those efforts and what they need to keep going, as well as recovery of in the event that somebody is found alive, bringing them back, like plane tickets and stuff like that. In the unfortunate event when they find somebody deceased, bringing their bodies or their ashes back for ceremony and healing. And so that's literally where donation money goes, or to get new equipment, like for searches and stuff like that. A lot of people have questions about where money goes, especially in this day and age. And unfortunately, there are groups that do take advantage of trauma in this crisis as well. And I just really wanted people to know where the donations go. It's always in direct benefit of the families and the people missing. So, yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for being here to have this conversation, and thank you to everyone who attended today. I just want to sit here for a moment. Let's just take 1 minute and just hang out and be. So thank you. So there are this week, there are other events happening. The Tending Our Roots series offered through the city of Portland. There will be proclamations and signings from Portland City Council, Multnomah County Board. And on May 5th, which is Thursday from 3 to 8, we have a Day of Awareness community gathering at the South Hawthorne waterfront and yoga with Acacia Red Elk. So, and there's many other events. So just encourage you to tune in to learn more and to support. We're now going to close this afternoon's event. And so I'd like to invite Jennifer Pirtle from PCC's Native Nations Club to sing us out. And when Jennifer is done singing, please click out of the event. Thank you very much for being here.
Hey,
hey ha ya oh hey da hey da hey da ya hey do hey da ya hey ha ya hey